My name is Alara Vance, or at least, that is the name I was born with. It's a name that feels like a photograph of a stranger now, a pressed flower from a garden I no longer visit. For most of my life, I have been Lena Rowe. Lena is the one who built a home inside herself when the world offered none. But to tell her story, I must first speak of Alara, the girl who had to disappear so that Lena could live. When I was 21, my sister told me I was a liability. She didn't shout it. Serafina never shouted. She delivered the words with the cool, quiet precision of a surgeon making an incision, right there in the living room of our family home in Port Sterling, a city that prided itself on its old money and even older secrets. A week later, my father, the Honorable Judge Marcus Vance, had the locks changed. My mother, Eleanor, left a single suitcase on the grand, wisteria-draped porch. There was no goodbye, no last look, just the silent, heavy finality of a door closing on my life. They said I was impulsive, that I lacked discretion, that I had brought shame upon the Vance name. But the truth, the one that lived and breathed in the space between their accusations, was that I refused to be silent about a wound they wanted to pretend was invisible. For 15 years, I became a ghost. I moved across the country, took a new name, and taught myself to live in the quiet spaces, the ones unnoticed by people like my family. I did it not out of shame, but as an act of preservation. I knew, with the certainty of a hunted thing, that they would never allow me to flourish if I remained within their orbit. Their definition of my life was a cage, and I had to fly so far they would forget I ever had wings. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, I walked into a federal courtroom where my sister was the one on trial. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The presiding judge, a woman I had met at a national conference, paused her reading of emotion, her eyes scanning the gallery. She squinted, a flicker of recognition crossing her sharp features. "Pardon me," she said, her voice carrying through the silent room. "Is that Governor Rowe?" Every head in that courtroom turned. Reporters, lawyers, spectators, all of them, their faces a sea of sudden curiosity. My sister's head snapped around, her perfectly composed mask shattering into disbelief. My father, sitting in the front row, stiffened as if struck. And in that one, suspended moment, all the years I had spent buried under the weight of their judgment cracked open. They had called me a failure, a disgrace, a ghost. But now, standing in the back of that room, the only thing louder than their stunned silence was the sound of the world finally, truly, seeing me. The air in the Vance home was always curated, smelling faintly of lemon oil and the salty brine of the nearby Atlantic. Our house in Port Sterling was less a home and more a museum of our family's legacy, each piece of antique furniture and every polished silver frame a testament to generations of influence. Sunday dinners were a ritual, presided over by my father from the head of the mahogany table. Judge Marcus Vance was a man carved from granite and law books, his presence filling every room with an unspoken demand for order and excellence. That evening, he raised a crystal glass to Serafina, my older sister. Her image was frozen on the muted television in the corner of the dining room, a network news segment on rising legal stars. To Serafina, he'd said, his voice resonant with pride. A true Vance. At 28, she was already a lead prosecutor for the district, her ambition a sharp, brilliant thing that cast long shadows. I, on the other hand, was one of those shadows. At 21, I had just graduated with a degree in literature and fine arts. Not law, not medicine, not finance. I hadn't even invited them to the ceremony. I knew their disappointment would be a guest too loud to ignore. I was the family's quiet anomaly, sketchbooks filled with charcoal portraits instead of legal briefs, pockets full of weathered poetry books. I found my solace not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the dappled light of city parks and the hushed halls of art galleries. I was a question my family had never bothered to answer. The storm that broke my life began not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet chime of a text message. It was from a friend, a frantic one-line question. Alara, are you okay? Then another. Then a call I ignored. When I finally opened my laptop, my world had already been set on fire. A private video, a tender moment between my ex-boyfriend and me, had been stolen from his laptop and posted online. It wasn't wild or sordid, just intimate. Two people in love, I had thought at the time. He, bitter and wounded after I had ended our relationship a month prior, had used it as a weapon. The violation was absolute, a theft of a part of my soul I had shared in trust. I learned later that Serafina was the first in the family to see it. She didn't call me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She forwarded the link to our father with a single, chilling sentence, "You need to handle this before it tarnishes us." Her concern wasn't for my heart, but for the family name. Dinner was canceled. My father stormed into my bedroom, his face a mask of cold fury. The air crackled around him. "Is this what we raised you for?" he seethed, his voice low and dangerous. To be seen by the world like some common piece of filth? He couldn't even bring himself to say the word. "I didn't do this," I whispered, my voice choked with tears I refused to let fall. "He stole it. I am the victim here." "You are a victim of your own poor judgment," he retorted, snatching my newly framed diploma from my desk and tossing it onto my bed. It landed beside my sketchbook like a final, damning piece of evidence against me. "You want to live without honor, then you will do it without the Vance name to protect you, without my roof over your head, and without my money in your pocket." My mother, Eleanor, stood in the doorway, her fingers twisting the pearls at her throat. She was a woman who had perfected the art of elegant retreat, and in that moment, she retreated from me completely. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over my shoulder, as if looking at me directly would stain her. I turned to Serafina, a desperate, silent plea in my eyes for some flicker of sisterhood, of solidarity. She just stood there, arms crossed, her expression as placid and impenetrable as a frozen lake. She didn't even blink. I packed in a daze, the setting sun casting long, mournful stripes across my bedroom floor. I took a few changes of clothes, my journals, my paints, and the worn canvas bag I'd carried through 4 years of university. When I walked into the foyer, my father was waiting. He placed my debit card on the hall table, its corner catching the light. "Do not call," he said, his voice flat. "Do not write. You are on your own." As I stepped out onto the porch, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me, I saw my mother's silhouette in the window. A shadow watching a shadow leave. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't shed a tear. She just watched until I was gone. The first few nights, I slept in my car, a little sedan that felt more like a tin can than a shelter. Then, when the $200 my father had left me began to dwindle, I sold the car for a few hundred more and bought a one-way bus ticket heading west. I didn't have a destination, just a direction, away. Somewhere no one knew the name Vance, somewhere my past couldn't find me. On the second night of that long journey, during a stop at a desolate station somewhere in the vast, dark plains of Texas, I did something quiet and final. I took out a small, leather-bound address book. It held family birthdays, my mother's recipes copied in her perfect script, the numbers of friends who had already stopped answering my calls. One by one, I tore out the pages and let them drift away on the night wind, small white ghosts disappearing into the darkness. The act wasn't angry, it was a release. I looked at my reflection in the grimy window of the bus, a girl with haunted eyes and smudged mascara, and I whispered to her, to myself, there is nothing left to lose. So I will begin with what is left of me. Havenwood, Oregon, greeted me not with sunshine, but with a gentle, persistent rain that seemed to wash the world clean. The city was green and quiet, a world away from the humid, heavy history of Port Sterling. The cold was a different kind, too crisp and cleansing, seeping into my thin jacket, but somehow not my spirit. I found a room for rent in a sprawling old house shared with 3 other people. The paint was peeling, the floorboards creaked with stories, and my room was little more than a closet with a window, but that window looked out onto a yard with a towering Douglas fir. It was the first home that was truly mine. I adopted a new name, Lena Rowe. Lena was simple, sturdy. Rowe was common, forgettable. I cut my long, dark hair short, watching the strands fall into the basin of a cracked bathroom sink. It was a shearing of the girl I had been, a quiet baptism. My days became a blur of work. I poured coffee at a bustling downtown cafe from dawn until mid-afternoon, memorizing the orders of strangers and offering smiles that didn't always reach my eyes. In the evenings, I cleaned a small community legal aid clinic, the scent of bleach and floor polish becoming the scent of my survival. Late at night, hunched over a wobbly desk in my room, I took online data entry jobs, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I transcribed endless columns of numbers. In the silence of those nights, when the house was asleep and the rain pattered against the glass, I would write. Not stories or poems, but fragmented thoughts in my journals. I filled page after page, documenting the slow, painful, and beautiful process of putting myself back together. I also painted. Art supplies were a luxury, so I used cheap acrylics on scraps of cardboard or discarded canvases I found at thrift stores. One night, I painted a figure walking away from a collapsing house into a vast, empty landscape under a sky full of stars. I hung it on the wall opposite my bed. It was a portrait of my own survival. A turning point came one evening at the legal clinic. I was mopping the reception area when I heard a frightened, hushed conversation in Spanish. A young woman was clutching the hand of her small son, her eyes wide with terror as a clinic paralegal impatiently tried to explain a complex legal document to her. The paralegal, overworked and tired, was speaking too fast, using jargon the woman clearly didn't understand. "You just need to sign here," the paralegal said, tapping the paper. "It's a standard intake form." But I had read the form earlier while cleaning the office. It wasn't standard. It was a waiver of certain rights, buried in fine print. Without thinking, I put down my mop. "Excuse me," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Both the paralegal and the young mother looked at me, surprised. That form isn't correct for her situation. She needs the FL 12, not the G4. It was something I'd overheard the lead attorney discussing earlier that week. The paralegal stared at me, annoyed. "And who are you?" "I'm Lena," I said simply. I turned to the woman and, in the gentle, careful Spanish my grandmother had taught me, explained what the form meant. Her shoulders relaxed, the fear in her eyes softening into gratitude. The next day, I was called into the office of the clinic's director, a kind, wise man named Davidson. I expected to be fired for overstepping. Instead, he looked at me with a curious, thoughtful expression. "The paralegal told me what you did," he said. "She was angry at first. Then she realized you were right. Where did you learn about immigration forms?" "I listen," I said. It was the truth. In my silent life, I had become an exceptional listener. He smiled. "Listening is a rare skill. So is compassion. We have a position opening for a case intake assistant. It doesn't pay much more than cleaning, but you wouldn't have to use a mop. Are you interested?" That was the beginning. I started at the bottom, filing papers, making coffee, and scheduling appointments. But I was a sponge. I read every file that crossed my desk. I sat in on client meetings, taking notes. I spent my nights not just doing data entry, but studying policy online, teaching myself the intricacies of immigration law. I began drafting memos for the attorneys, then helping with research for their cases. My life found a new rhythm, one defined not by what I had lost, but by what I was building. One evening, after helping a family secure asylum after they fled violence in their home country, the youngest attorney at the clinic, a bright-eyed idealist named Sarah, asked me, "Why do you work so hard at this, Lena? It's like a calling for you." I looked out the window at the rainy Havenwood streets, the streetlights reflecting like scattered jewels on the wet pavement. I didn't have to search for the answer. It was the bedrock on which I'd built my new life. I don't have a family to go home to, I said softly. So I decided to build a safe harbor for others who feel lost. It's the closest thing to home I have. And in that small, underfunded clinic, surrounded by the quiet hum of purpose, the ghost of Alara Vance finally began to fade, and Lena Rose started to feel real. She was no longer just a name. She was a woman with a place in the world, a place she had carved out for herself, with her own 2 hands. 5 years after I first set foot in Havenwood, my name, Lena Rowe, had become synonymous with a quiet, unyielding form of advocacy. I was no longer an assistant at the clinic. I was its director. Under my leadership, we had expanded, secured major grants, and become a formidable voice for immigrant rights in the state of Oregon. I never sought the spotlight. I turned down most interview requests, and my photo rarely appeared in the press. My power was not in being seen, but in being effective. Lawmakers learned that when Lena Rose scheduled a meeting, it was wise to take it. One afternoon, I stood before the state legislature's Judiciary Committee. A controversial bill was being proposed, one that would allow local law enforcement to cooperate more closely with federal immigration agents, effectively turning schools and hospitals into traps. The chamber was filled with powerful lobbyists and stern-faced politicians. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium not with anger, but with a deep, resonant calm. A law that forces a child to choose between seeing a doctor and risking their family's separation is not a law that serves justice, I said, my voice even and clear, carrying to every corner of the ornate room. It is a law that serves fear. And a society governed by fear has already lost its soul. The room was silent. A few of the younger legislators nodded slowly. The bill was eventually defeated in committee, a quiet victory that sent ripples through the state's political landscape. After the hearing, a reporter from the state's largest newspaper cornered me in the hallway. "That was a powerful speech, Ms. Rowe," he said, pen poised over his notepad. "People are talking about you. They're saying you should run for office. We'd love to do a feature profile, a deep dive into who you are." A familiar chill, the ghost of an old fear, ran down my spine. To be seen, to be known, it was still a risk. "Thank you," I said politely, "but I prefer to let the work speak for itself." "No personal story? No background?" he pressed. "Readers want to connect. They can connect with the families we're fighting for," I replied, offering a small, firm smile before walking away. That night, in my small but comfortable apartment, a significant upgrade from my first room, I lit a single candle. It was a ritual I'd kept for years. In front of the candle was a small, framed piece of art I'd made. It was a kintsugi bowl, a Japanese art form where broken pottery is repaired with gold lacquer, making the cracks part of its beauty, its history. It was a metaphor for my own life. Before blowing out the flame, I whispered the same words I always did: "Be known for what you have mended, not for how you were broken." I never searched for my family online. The temptation was a ghost limb, an ache for a connection I knew was poisoned. To look them up would be to invite their world, their definitions, back into mine. My healing depended on that distance. It was a boundary I guarded fiercely. Marian, the chair of my clinic's board and a woman who had spent 30 years navigating the city's political corridors, once sat with me after a particularly grueling board meeting. "Lena," she said, her voice warm and wise, "you've built something incredible here. But you hold your own story so close. Don't you ever want to let people in? To let them see the whole of you?" I considered her question, stirring my tea. "They do see the whole of me, Marian," I replied. "The me I chose to become. The past is a different country. I'm not hiding from it, but I'm not a citizen there anymore." The truth was, I feared being found less than I feared being misunderstood. I didn't want my story to be sensationalized, to become a tabloid headline that would overshadow the vital work I was doing. I didn't want to be the disgraced judge's daughter. I wanted to be Lena Rowe, the woman who built bridges for the forgotten. But my quiet determination had created its own momentum. A few months later, at a community rally in a downtown Havenwood Park, surrounded by the people I had fought for. I stood on a makeshift stage and announced my candidacy for the Oregon State House of Representatives. Ives. I am not a politician, I told the small but passionate crowd. I am a citizen who believes that power should belong to those who have the courage to care. I am not running to represent a party. I am running to represent the quiet voices, the ones who are told to wait their turn, the ones who have been left out of the conversation for too long. My campaign was unconventional. My posters featured no smiling headshot, only a simple, elegant design with my name and a single quote: "Justice is what love looks like in public." I didn't speak of my family, my upbringing, or my past. I spoke of policy, of community, of a future we could build together. And with that, I stepped onto a much larger stage. It was a new kind of battle, one fought not in the shadows, but in the light. And, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of who might see me. I was ready to be seen, but on my own terms. The headline appeared on a news alert on my phone during a break between budget meetings. Prominent Port Sterling prosecutor under federal investigation. Below it, a name I hadn't spoken in a decade: Serafina Vance. My heart gave a strange, complicated lurch. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was the feeling of a distant earthquake, a tremor from a world I had long since abandoned. The story unfolded over the next few days. A whistleblower had come forward with evidence that Serafina had systematically suppressed exculpatory evidence in a series of high-profile cases to maintain her perfect conviction record. It was a scandal of immense proportions, a betrayal of the very system our father had dedicated his life to upholding. Her allies called it a political witch hunt. Activists called it a long-overdue reckoning. My staff, fiercely protective, immediately went into defense mode. "Governor, you need to stay out of this," my chief of staff, Ben, advised, his face grim. "Any comment will link you to a story that has nothing to do with you or your administration." He was right, of course. It wasn't my fight. And yet it was. The ghosts of the Vance family were being paraded on national television, and whether I liked it or not, I was one of them. Without telling anyone on my team, I booked a commercial flight to Port Sterling. I didn't take a security detail. I packed a small overnight bag and flew coach, another anonymous face in the crowd. When I arrived at the federal courthouse, I was dressed in a simple dark pantsuit, my hair pulled back, a pair of large sunglasses hiding my eyes. I slipped in through a side entrance and found a seat in the very last row of the gallery, a space reserved for shadows and ghosts. The courtroom was a sterile, tense theater. Lawyers whispered, reporters typed furiously on their laptops. At the defendant's table sat Serafina, as impeccably dressed and composed as ever. But I saw the tension in the set of her jaw, the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as they rested on the table. She looked brittle, like a porcelain doll on the verge of cracking. My mother sat behind her, a pillar of strained elegance, and next to her, my father, his face a stony mask of controlled rage. He looked older, smaller than the giant of my memory. Then, the judge entered. I recognized her instantly. Judge Althea Washington, a formidable jurist known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense demeanor. We had served on a panel together at a governor's conference the year before. She took her seat, her gaze sweeping the room with practiced authority. Her eyes moved over the rows of faces and then they stopped. On me. A flicker of confusion, then recognition. She leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the hushed air. "Pardon me," she said, addressing one of the court officers, but looking directly at me. "But is that Governor Rowe?" A profound silence fell over the courtroom. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Every single head swiveled in my direction. The reporters in the front row looked back, their eyes wide. A camera flashed, a stark, blinding light in the dim gallery. Serafina's head whipped around, her eyes locking with mine. The carefully constructed composure on her face crumbled, replaced by raw, uncomprehending shock. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a stifled gasp escaping her lips. My father leaned forward, squinting as if he couldn't trust his own eyes, as if the daughter he had erased had materialized before him not as a broken failure, but as something else entirely. Something powerful. I didn't move. I didn't smile or nod. I simply met their gazes, my own expression calm, steady. My presence was my statement. Judge Washington, ever the professional, cleared her throat and brought the proceedings back to order. But the atmosphere in the room had irrevocably shifted. Throughout the rest of the hearing, glances were stolen in my direction. The story was no longer just about Serafina's fall from grace. It was now about the impossible, unbelievable return of the other Vance daughter. I stayed until the court adjourned for the day. Then, just as quietly as I had entered, I rose and walked out, the hushed whispers of the gallery following me like a wake. No one tried to stop me. No one called my name. By the time I reached my hotel, my phone was a constant vibration of calls and texts from every major news outlet in the country. My face, caught in that one camera flash, was already everywhere. The ghost of Port Sterling, Governor Lena Rowe's secret past. I stood at the window of my hotel room, looking out at the city lights twinkling over the harbor, the same lights I used to watch from my childhood bedroom. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass, no longer a lost girl, but a woman who had found her own way home, to herself. I had returned not as a daughter seeking forgiveness, but as a witness. And my testimony was my life itself. It took less than a day for the story of my courtroom appearance to become a national obsession. The narrative of Serafina's downfall was now inextricably linked with my improbable rise. The media, hungry for a new angle, began digging. The forgotten Vance daughter, from family exile to governor's mansion. And then, inevitably, someone found it. The old video. The grainy, pixelated clip of a 21-year-old girl, her heart on her sleeve, in a moment of private trust that had been twisted into public shame. It resurfaced, spreading across social media and tabloid sites like a virus. The narrative shifted again, this time with a sharper, more judgmental edge. My ex-boyfriend was interviewed on a cable news show, offering a hollow, self-serving apology. "We were just kids," he said with a practiced shrug. I never thought it would blow up like this. I watched the segment alone in my office in Havenwood, my hands resting calmly on my desk. My staff was in a panic. "We need to issue a statement," my press secretary urged. "We can condemn the network, threaten a lawsuit for invasion of privacy." "No," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. "We do nothing." "But Governor." "Let them look," I said, my gaze steady. "I have survived being seen before. I am not that girl anymore. They are attacking a ghost." Then came the call I had been half expecting. My father. His voice on the phone was exactly as I remembered it, an instrument of command, laced with ice. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, forgoing any greeting. "You are dragging this family's name through the mud for your own political theater." I leaned back in my leather chair, the view of the green Oregon mountains behind me a world away from the suffocating grandeur of his study. "Your name," I said, my voice even, devoid of the old fear he used to inspire. I stopped considering it mine a long time ago. The life I built as Lena Rowe. You don't get to claim ownership of my successes any more than you claimed responsibility for my pain. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, then a sharp click. He had hung up. Later that night, I received a call from an old family friend in Port Sterling. My mother, Eleanor, had collapsed from the stress and had been taken to the hospital. High blood pressure, a panic attack. Against my better judgment, a flicker of old duty I thought I had extinguished compelled me to act. I took the red eye back to Port Sterling. I walked into her private hospital room unannounced. She looked impossibly fragile in the sterile white bed, the imperious matriarch I remembered replaced by a tired, frightened woman. Wires and tubes connected her to beeping machines. Her eyes fluttered open and found me standing in the doorway. Alara, she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. It was the first time she had used my birth name in 15 years. I didn't move closer. I just stood there, a silent observer. If what they say about Serafina is true, she began, her breath catching, and what you've become is true, then I have spent so many years being blind. Tears welled in her eyes, tracing new lines on her powdered cheeks. This was the moment I had once fantasized about, the apology, the regret. But now that it was here, I felt a strange and placid emptiness. The wound was so old, its scar tissue thick and smooth. It no longer ached for a soothing touch. I walked to her bedside and, for a moment, I took her hand. It felt small and cool in mine. I held it not as a daughter offering forgiveness, but as one human being acknowledging the pain of another. There were no words. Forgiveness was a country I wasn't ready to visit, and a cheap pardon would have been a lie. When she drifted into a medicated sleep, I reached into my bag and took out a small, framed print of one of my early paintings, the one of the figure walking away from the collapsing house into a starry expanse. I placed it on her bedside table. Its title was Begin Again. Then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the past where it belonged. Back in Havenwood, the media storm was at its peak. Reporters camped outside my office, their cameras and microphones like weapons poised to strike. I offered them nothing. No interviews, no statements, no emotional displays. At my next press conference, scheduled to announce a new green energy initiative, the room was packed. The first question wasn't about the initiative. Governor Rowe, a reporter called out, "In light of the recent revelations about your past, do you have a comment on the personal attacks from your family?" I stood at the podium, calm and centered. "My past is a matter of public record," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "A record that shows I was the victim of a crime. A record that shows I rebuilt my life through hard work and a commitment to public service. I will not be defined by the actions of those who tried to erase me. My story is one of resilience, and I will not apologize for it." Now, are there any questions about the renewable energy plan that will create 5,000 jobs in the state? A stunned silence fell over the press corps. I had not taken their bait. I had not been defensive or angry. I had simply taken their narrative and reforged it into a shield. The power to define my story, I had realized, had always been my own. I just had to be brave enough to claim it. The indictment came down on a rainy Tuesday. Serafina Vance was officially charged with multiple counts of obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. The legal dynasty my father had so carefully constructed had publicly crumbled. The whispers of a plea bargain began to circulate. That evening, my personal cell phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was no longer imperious or fragile, but desperate, pleading. "Alara, Mija," she said, the old endearment feeling foreign and sharp on her tongue. "Please, come home. Just for dinner. We need to be a family." A family. The word was a bitter irony. Later, a text from my father. "We need you." Not, "We miss you," or "We are sorry." But, "We need you." A summons. After 15 years of exile, I was being recalled not as a daughter, but as a resource. Against all logic, driven by a sliver of curiosity I couldn't extinguish, I agreed. I flew to Port Sterling that Friday. The house looked the same, the wisteria still clinging to the porch columns, but the grand facade seemed to sag with the weight of its own secrets. Eleanor opened the door, her smile forced, her eyes shadowed with anxiety. Marcus stood behind her, his posture ramrod straight, a general surveying a battlefield he was about to lose. And at the dining room table, her head bowed, sat Serafina. She looked hollowed out, the brilliant fire in her eyes reduced to embers. The seat they had set for me was my old one at the far end of the table. They had reupholstered it in new, pristine leather. A superficial fix for a deeply broken thing. The meal was a feast, my mother's famous shrimp and grits, a rack of lamb, wine decanted and breathing in the center of the table. It was a performance of normalcy, and no one was eating. Eleanor chattered nervously about old childhood memories, her words like brittle leaves skittering across a vast silence. Marcus made a strained attempt at praise. Your work in Oregon is very impressive, Ilara. I read your public safety initiative. Well drafted. Finally, Serafina looked up, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. I know I made mistakes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I was trying to live up to what he expected. She flickered a glance at our father. Then came the real reason for the invitation. We were thinking, Eleanor began, her hand hovering near mine before retreating, that perhaps you could speak to the U.S. attorney. Not as a governor, of course. Just as a sister. A character witness. A quiet word. Family helps family. I looked at them. At my mother, whose love was conditional. At my father, whose pride was his only god. At my sister, the architect of my exile, now begging for a key to her own cage. I set my fork down on the china plate. The small click echoed in the silent room. I have a question, I said, my voice level, calm, and stripped of all emotion but clarity. If I were still Lena Rowe, the woman who poured coffee and cleaned floors in Oregon, would I be sitting at this table tonight? If I had nothing to offer you, no power, no influence, would I still be your family? The silence that answered was vast and damning. It held the truth of 15 years. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The new leather groaned in protest. I am the woman I am today not because I am a Vance, I said softly, looking at each of them in turn. I am the woman I am today because I survived being one. I walked to the door, my coat brushing against a vase of funereal lilies on the hall table. Ilara, please, my mother cried, her voice cracking. But I didn't turn back. I stepped out into the cool, salty night air. The heavy oak door closed behind me, and this time, I was the one who was free. The weight of their house, their name, their expectations, it all fell away. I walked away carrying nothing but myself. And for the first time, it felt like enough. The real attack came not as a confrontation, but as a whisper campaign. It started a week after the disastrous family dinner. Anonymous leaks to right-wing blogs. Screenshots of old, emotional emails I'd written to friends in my early 20s. A candid, unflattering photo of me taken outside a shelter in Havenwood years ago, my face streaked with tears after a devastating loss for one of my clients. The headline read, "The Unstable Governor, a History of Emotional Recklessness." My father's fingerprints were all over it. It wasn't a direct assault, but a strategic poisoning of the well. A warning. You won't help us? We can still hurt you. My team was ready for war. My chief of staff presented me with a dossier, a plan for counterattacks, for opposition research on my own father. We can fight fire with fire, Governor, he said, his eyes blazing. I looked at the file, at the ugly machinery of political warfare, and I pushed it back across the desk. No, Ben, I said. We're not going to fight on their terms. We are not going to become them in order to beat them. Instead of hiding or fighting back in the shadows, I walked directly into the light. The next morning, I called an unscheduled press conference. I stood at the podium alone. No flags, no phalanx of aides. Behind me, on a large screen, was a simple, powerful image, the kintsugi bowl from my apartment. There is an old saying, I began, my voice resonating with a quiet strength that filled the room. What is broken can be made stronger. For the past few weeks, there have been attempts to use my past, my private pain, and my personal history as a weapon against me. These attempts have come from places very close to home. They are designed to paint me as unstable, emotional, and unfit to lead. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Let me be clear. Yes, I have been emotional. I have grieved. I have felt pain. I have felt injustice so keenly it has brought me to my tears. My capacity for emotion is not a weakness. It is the source of my compassion. It is the engine of my work. It is why I am standing here today. Then I pivoted. And it is why today I am introducing a new piece of landmark legislation. the Public Trust and Integrity Act. This bill will establish unprecedented protections for whistleblowers and victims of smear campaigns, and it will criminalize the use of familial relationships to exert undue influence or issue threats in matters of public office. I didn't name my family. I didn't have to. I had taken their private war and turned it into a public good. I had transformed their weapon into a shield, not just for me, but for anyone who might ever find themselves in my position. The media narrative shifted on a dime. The story was no longer about my unstable past. It was about my strength. Governor Rowe flips the script, turns personal attack into landmark legislation. A masterclass in political judo. My father went silent. My mother stopped calling. The whispers ceased. I had won, not by destroying them, but by refusing to be destroyed. Later that week, I walked through a farmer's market in downtown Havenwood. The sun was shining, the air smelled of basil and damp earth. No one pointed or stared. A woman selling honey offered me a sample. A father with his child on his shoulders nodded a simple, "Hello, Governor." I was just Lena, a part of the community I had chosen, a part of the life I had built. I had finally integrated the broken pieces of my past, not by hiding them, but by overlaying them with the gold of my own hard-won truth. And the result was something stronger, more beautiful, and entirely my own. Months passed. The federal case against Serafina proceeded, ending not with a dramatic trial, but with a quiet plea deal. She was disbarred and sentenced to 2 years in a minimum security prison. The Vance name, once a symbol of power in Port Sterling, was now a footnote in a cautionary tale. One afternoon, my assistant buzzed my office. "Governor, your sister is here to see you." I felt a stillness settle over me. "She has an appointment?" "No, ma'am. She just showed up. She says it's important." I hesitated for only a moment. "Send her in." The woman who walked into my office was not the Serafina I knew. The designer suit was gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was unstyled, her face bare of makeup. She looked tired, diminished, but for the first time, she looked real. She sat in the chair opposite my desk, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "I don't know where to start," she began, her voice soft, stripped of its usual sharp confidence. "Except to say that for my entire life, I was jealous of you." I said nothing, just listened. "You had a freedom I never did," she continued, her gaze fixed on her hands. "You didn't care about what father wanted. You just were yourself. I thought that was a weakness. I spent my whole life trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect prosecutor, the perfect Vance. I stepped on anyone who got in my way. Especially you." Her voice broke. "I was the one who told father to cut you off completely. I told him you were a stain we had to remove." Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I know I deserve what's coming to me. I needed you to hear it from me. I destroyed the only chance we ever had of being sisters, and by the time I realized it, you were so far above me I couldn't even see you anymore." I looked at her, at the ruins of the woman who had once held so much power over me. And I felt not anger, not triumph, but a deep, quiet sadness for the both of us, for the years the locusts had eaten. "You didn't destroy me, Serafina," I said, my voice gentle. "You just gave me a reason to build my own world. And in my world, my worth isn't determined by anyone else." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mom and Dad still think, they still believe you could have saved me." I turned my gaze to the window, to the vast, open sky over the Oregon mountains. "I'm not in the business of saving people," I said. "I learned a long time ago that the only person you can truly save is yourself." As she stood to leave, a broken woman about to pay her debts, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not hating me." I didn't reply. There was no hug, no easy absolution. Forgiveness was a complex landscape, and I was still charting its terrain. After she left, I opened a drawer in my desk and looked at a document I had drafted and printed that morning, a letter to the U.S. attorney, a plea for leniency for my sister, filled with carefully chosen words about childhood pressure and the possibility of redemption. I picked it up, walked over to the paper shredder, and fed it through. Some stories don't get a rewritten ending. They just get an ending. Mine had. That afternoon, I walked out of my office and into the city, my city. I was alone, but not lonely. I was a woman built of resilience, a governor, a leader, a survivor. But more than anything, I was Lena. Whole and free. The invitation was to speak at a small community forum in a neighborhood library in a quiet part of Havenwood. The topic was building a life of purpose. No press, no fanfare. It was the kind of event I loved most. When I arrived, I wasn't wearing a suit. Just comfortable slacks and a soft cashmere sweater. I milled about, getting myself a cup of tea, listening to the conversations around me. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't stand behind the podium. I sat on a stool at the front of the room, creating a circle of shared space. People often ask me how I managed to build a life after losing everything I began, my voice warm and conversational. The truth is, I didn't lose everything. I lost things that were never truly mine to begin with. A name I didn't choose, a home that felt like a museum, a family's approval that was always conditional. When I lost all that, I was finally free to find what was actually mine. I spoke about resilience, not as a form of hardness, but as a form of gentle persistence, like a river finding its way around stones. I spoke about boundaries as acts of self-love, and about forgiveness as something you give yourself first. During the Q&A, a young woman with bright, hopeful eyes asked, "But what if they come back? What if the people who hurt you change and want to be in your life again?" I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. That is a beautiful question. My answer is this: I will wish them well on their journey. But my own path is set. My story has been written, and I am not adding any more chapters from my past. The future is an open book, and I am the only author. As the event wrapped up and people began to disperse into the cool evening air, a figure emerged from the back of the room. It was my father. He was alone, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. He walked slowly toward me, not with his old, authoritative stride, but with the hesitant steps of an old man. He stopped a few feet away. He didn't try to touch me. He didn't offer an excuse. He just looked at me, his daughter, the governor, the stranger. "I never understood you, Alara," he said, his voice raspy with an emotion I couldn't name. "I see that now. But I think maybe I don't have to. I just have to acknowledge that you built something magnificent. On your own." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting mine again. "And I see you. I finally see you." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was simply a confession. A surrender. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to embrace him. I simply gave a small, slow nod of my head. A gesture of peace. An acceptance of what was and what could never be. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening shadows. I stepped outside into the crisp, clean air. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep twilight sky. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a lifetime finally, truly lift from my shoulders. I had not sought revenge. I had sought peace. I had not wanted to be seen by them. I had needed to see myself. And standing there, under the vast and quiet sky, I knew I had succeeded. My name was Lena Rowe, and I was home. Sometimes, the quietest revolutions are the ones that happen within our own hearts. The journey to self-worth is not about proving others wrong, but about proving to yourself that you were right all along. We cannot choose the family we are born into, but we can choose the family we create, the legacy we build, and the truth we decide to live by. Standing on your own is not a sign of loneliness. It is a testament to your own strength. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory of all.